Morning from Bear Country, California. I'm Dr. Caroline Heldman, and here are your headlines for the third week of September 2021. The big headline this past week, of course, being the recall election. Californians handily put down the recall, supporting the current governor, Gavin Newsom, about 2-1. And according to exit polls, obviously this is a state that has a lot of Democrats, and they drove this particular recall. But we saw a couple of things interesting happening in the days leading up to the recall. The first is that it does appear that fears around a Roe v. Wade type of situation happening in California, similar to what had happened in Texas, were something that drove some Democrats to the polls. And if you recall, Elizabeth Warren visited the state and made exactly that appeal, saying, look, we don't want to become like Texas. Don't put a Trump person in the governorship here, because we could become like Texas that essentially just repealed Roe v. Wade. Now, that rhetoric is hyperbolic, but the fear did drive some to go to vote against recalling Newsom. So to support Newsom. If you recall, there were two parts of the ballot. One is, do you want to remove the governor? And two, who do you want to vote for? And so on that first question, 2-1, folks voted against removing the governor. But Trumpism wasn't the biggest thing on the agenda. The biggest driver of the recall was actually the COVID-19 pandemic. So that was the topic that was mentioned the most, and folks like Gavin Newsom's approach to the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of vaccine mandates and in terms of mask mandates. So what does this mean for the nation? Well, 75% of Americans have gotten at least one vaccine. About 25% of Americans are either vaccine hesitant or just not going to get that vaccine. Just a numbers game. This is a good political playbook for Democrats because of the popularity of actually, addressing a global pandemic using common sense and science. And so the Republicans, while they have very fervent anti-vax supporters, the numbers are not big enough to win elections. It's only 1 in 4 Americans overall. And while there might be pockets of the country where Republicans can continue to make anti-science appeals in order to win elections, it's simply not going to work in most parts of the country, because folks generally understand this to be a public health crisis and understand that masking works, that vaccinations work. So getting back to the recall, in terms of exit polls, how did this go? Massive gender gap. Almost a 20-point gender gap. It's hard to say whether or not women were voting in favor of Gavin Newsom because of his feminist stances and policies, like repealing taxes on diapers, repealing taxes on menstruation products, openly supporting women's leadership and calling himself a feminist. His wife, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, goes by the first partner of California rather than the first lady, to make that office more gender inclusive. So this has been gender and feminist issues have been a high priority for Gavin Newsom. But also, it's hard to say, maybe folks were voting against Larry Elder, who has talked about, women who attended the Women's March not being attractive enough to be raped, talking about the gender wage gap and saying it's not real, as well as allegations from a former girlfriend of domestic violence. We also know that there was, in this recall, a late surge of Latino voting, most of which broke for Gavin Newsom. We also saw that 81% of Black Californians did not vote for potentially the first Black governor in Larry Elder, the biggest competitor against Newsom, but rather voted for Gavin Newsom. So this really interesting approach of voting for somebody whom you believe will better represent your interests versus someone who looks like you. But again, just to wrap this up, the number one thing driving the recall election in California and keeping the governor in place was his handling of the pandemic. This should be the playbook for Democrats moving into the 2022 election. Next big headline, it has come out that Mike Pence was actually pushing harder to overturn the results of the election on January 6th than previously thought. I think Mike Pence has gotten a lot of kind of cover because he was targeted, his life was targeted during the violent insurrection of January 6th. But there are details coming out now that he actually consulted with Dan Quayle, the former vice president under George W. Bush. I'm sorry, under George Herbert Walker Bush. There we go. And that Dan Quayle told him, you do not have the power to do anything on January 6th. That is not the power given to you by the Constitution. Your role there is simply, essentially ceremonial. So Mike Pence, no stoic savior of democracy, but rather someone who was looking for a way to overthrow the election in order to fulfill Donald Trump's, desire to become a dictatorship and override our democracy. Third big headline. After the election, Donald Trump was, according to insiders, so despondent and unhinged that folks thought that there might be a serious mental health issue driving his potentially going to war and pressing the button for nuclear war. So General Milley, the head of the Joint Chiefs, went ahead and had conversations with his counterparts in China to allay their concerns that nuclear war was imminent. They had that information from somewhere. And so Milley did his job, spoke to the counterparts in other countries, including China, and allayed their fears about this. He also went to other generals and others in charge and said, look, if Donald Trump decides to get us into nuclear war, if he decides to do this unilaterally, I'm going to be a stop in that process. Now, it didn't come to that. That would have been a constitutional crisis because the power does lie unilaterally with the president to engage, to press the button for nuclear war, as long as the war is legal and follows the rules of war. Now, by definition, I think nuclear war is unlawful in the sense that one of the rules of war is that you cannot unnecessarily target civilians. And so you would be hard pressed to make the case that nuclear war would be justified because it would inevitably target many civilians. And so this brings up a host of questions we haven't actually had to address yet. But had it come to that, Milley maybe would have been in violation of the Constitution. It did not come to that. So all of these calls from the right wing about treason are misplaced. Milley was doing his job, and it really, begs the question that if it would have been unconstitutional for Milley to stand in the way of Donald Trump simply deciding he wants to go to war because he lost an election, because he's mentally unstable, are our processes, the processes we have in place, adequate to protect against the instability or potential instability of a commander-in-chief? I would argue the answer is no. 1 in 500 Americans have now died from COVID-19. 665,000 deaths, little white flags now on the National Mall to give a visual representation of that. This is a pandemic that is now being driven by states with low vaccination rates. If you look at where the spread is happening and how it is happening, that's how it's happening. It's the 25% of Americans who are anti-vaxxers or who are vaccine hesitant. We know that unvaccinated folks are 11 times more likely to die from COVID-19 than vaccinated folks, 11 times more likely to die. But that data point is not getting through to people. We have had mass manipulation from our political leaders around vaccination, around the science of vaccinations and masks, and that has allowed some Americans to be, I would argue, misinformed about how they can best protect themselves and their community. This is why political leadership matters so much. This is why data-driven, science-grounded political leadership matters so much. And as we saw with the recall election, it's not just good science, it's also good politics to follow good science. At the present time, the Democrats will be heavily favored in making appeals in the 2022 election that are based on science because 3 in 4 Americans are doing what is best for themselves and for their community by getting vaccinated. Last big headline, 4 Olympians, including Aly Raisman and Simone Biles, appeared to testify before Congress about the FBI's mishandling of the Larry Nassar investigation. They are indicting the institutions of the FBI and of USA Gymnastics, just as campus rape survivors have indicted educational institutions and Hollywood survivors have indicted that entire industry and institution for the role that it played in both allowing sexual violence to happen and then covering it up after the fact. Christopher Wray, the current head of the FBI, who was not in charge at the time of this investigation, apologized profusely. He said he does not know why this was not further investigated. But I can tell you, having worked with survivors and institutions for many decades, institutions systematically betray survivors. We call this institutional betrayal. Professor Dr. Fried over at the University of Oregon has written extensively about this, and she has found that survivors who are betrayed by their institutions have much higher rates of mental health issues and trauma and PTSD than survivors who are actually helped and their issues actually addressed by their institution. The problem is that there are a lot of perverse incentives to stop institutions from actually listening to survivors, believing survivors, and addressing what happened and preventing it from happening to other folks. The biggest drivers are reputational loss or damage for the institution should this information become public. And also a lot of institutions face economic pressure, and I'm assuming USA Gymnastics faced economic pressure. But for the FBI, it is absolutely inexcusable for them to have not taken these heart-wrenching, horrific stories of sexual violence against children and not doing something with it. I do believe that that should entail a criminal investigation to get to the bottom of why these girls and young women were so profoundly betrayed by our systems of government. As you head out into the last days of this week, please be gentle with yourself, be kind to others, and rock on.